Robert Hartley did not begin with a grand design. He arrived at it the way many men arrive at corruption, incrementally, through rationalization. The plantation in Virginia had been in his family since 1768. By the 1830s, tobacco margins were tightening. Soil depletion, market volatility, debt cycles that swallowed less careful planters whole. Robert considered himself disciplined, unlike his father. He would not lose what had been built. The woman was 19 when he first selected her. Strong frame, proven fertility within her family line. That was how he evaluated her. She had a name, but in his records, she never appeared with it. In the plantation books, she was categorized only by age and labor designation. In the private ledger he began keeping in 1838, she became a symbol. The first pregnancy was recorded as an inconvenience that might offset costs. The child was healthy, sold through an intermediary in Richmond. The placement was quiet, discreet. The payment exceeded what a strong field hand could generate in several years. Robert recalculated. The second pregnancy was intentional. After that, the arrangement solidified into policy. The woman was moved to a cabin at the edge of the plantation grounds, far enough to isolate, close enough to monitor. She was removed from heavy field labor, but not from work entirely. Her task became gestation. Recovery periods were shortened progressively. 18 pregnancies would follow over 18 years. Rachel entered the system during the third birth. She was skilled, trained informally, but experienced. Robert valued competence. Infant mortality reduced profit. Rachel ensured survival rates remained high. She brought herbs to stimulate contractions, salves to reduce tearing, techniques passed down through generations of midwives who understood bodies better than most physicians of the time. At first, the woman recovered between pregnancies. Slowly, visibly. But the intervals tightened. By the 7th birth, exhaustion lingered. By the 10th, she developed chronic anemia. Pale gums, dizziness, swelling in her legs. By the 12th, her hips ached constantly. She could no longer stand upright for long periods. Robert noticed the decline but calculated it as depreciation, not warning. Children were removed within 3 days. Sometimes sooner. Separation limited attachment. It also reduced risk of exposure. Most infants were transported to foundling homes in Richmond, or placed directly with childless families, who asked few questions about origins so long as paperwork appeared legitimate. Robert maintained correspondence with intermediaries under coded language. Payments were logged separately from tobacco revenue. He never mixed the streams in public accounts. By the 15th pregnancy, the woman's body was permanently altered. Stretch marks layered over scar tissue. Pelvic damage. Persistent infections Rachel treated as best she could with boiled cloth and diluted alcohol. There was no true rest. Only intervals. The enslaved community observed everything. They knew when she disappeared into labor. They heard the newborn cries. They saw the infants carried away. They understood the pattern long before any white visitor could have noticed. No open rebellion occurred. That would have meant immediate, lethal retaliation. Instead, memory accumulated. The 16th birth required assistance from 2 additional women. Labor extended past 30 hours. Contractions weakened unpredictably. The woman drifted in and out of consciousness. Rachel worried for the first time that survival was not guaranteed. She survived. Robert increased oversight. By the 17th birth, her weight had dropped dramatically. She ate but could not retain nutrients. Her body had become a site of extraction. Rachel began documenting more than medical facts. She wrote about the woman's silence, about the way she stared at the cabin wall after each child was taken, about how she stopped asking where they went. 18 pregnancies, 18 births, 18 children removed within days. The final pregnancy began in late 1855. The woman was 44. Her body should not have been asked to perform again. Any competent physician would have warned against it. But physicians were not consulted unless death appeared imminent. And profit had not yet declined. By early 1856, she was confined to the cabin permanently. Bed sores formed along her hips and lower back. Her breathing became labored even at rest. Edema swelled her ankles. She could walk only a few feet unassisted. Rachel reported concerns. Robert reviewed the numbers instead. He had weathered multiple poor tobacco seasons because of the income generated through placements. He had reserves. He had maintained reputation. He had proven himself clever. The system, he believed, worked. What he did not calculate was cumulative cost, not in money but in strain. The plantation workforce had watched 18 pregnancies unfold. They had watched her weaken. They had watched babies vanish. They had understood precisely what was happening. And systems built on bodies eventually inherit the limits of those bodies. The 18th labor would begin in late May 1856. And it would not end cleanly. Rachel continued documenting the plantation with an unflinching eye, knowing that each record might be the only witness to atrocities no one else could acknowledge. The woman, Sarah, if that was her name, was enduring her 18th pregnancy at 44 years old, an age when most bodies could no longer sustain even a single healthy birth under normal circumstances. But this wasn't a normal circumstance. For nearly 2 decades, she had been made to repeat a cycle of isolation, labor, and grief. Each pregnancy sapped her strength. Each delivery left her more worn. Each child removed within days ensured she would never know motherhood in the way any human being should. By late summer of 1855, Sarah's condition had deteriorated drastically. Rachel, noting the signs of extreme malnutrition, swelling, and exhaustion, tried desperately to intervene. She warned Robert that continuing with another pregnancy might be fatal, and she brought Elelina, his second wife, to plead the case. But practicality and profit ruled over empathy. Robert considered the calculus of loss. One final child might still yield hundreds of dollars. Sarah's life was merely a variable in a ledger. She would carry this last pregnancy, regardless of the risk. The months that followed were a slow, brutal torture. Sarah could barely leave her bed. The swelling in her extremities cracked her skin. She suffered from persistent nausea and fever that refused to break. Rachel's diary entries from this time are filled with a mix of despair and clinical observation. She cannot keep food down. Her body is giving out. Every moment seems to bring her closer to collapse. But she endures. She continues, though death would be a mercy. Rachel remained at her side, applying herbal remedies, monitoring the faint signs of labor, talking to her relentlessly to keep her conscious. Other women were called to assist, but there was only so much they could do with the tools and knowledge available. When early labor began in May 1856, Sarah was 6 weeks premature. The labor lasted 42 hours. Her body, broken by 18 pregnancies, could no longer sustain even the basic functions of childbirth. Contractions came and went weekly. Her exhaustion prevented effective pushing. Rachel and the assistants worked feverishly, guiding the baby, attempting to stimulate contractions and keeping Sarah conscious. At dawn on June 4th, a tiny girl emerged, alive but fragile, weighing no more than 4 pounds. Rachel's hands trembled as she worked to clear the infant's airways, warm her, and sustain her fragile breathing. But Sarah could not survive. She hemorrhaged heavily, unable to deliver the afterbirth. Within 20 minutes, she was dead, her body exhausted, her life extinguished on a straw mattress in a cabin at the plantation's edge. Rachel held the newborn, her grief mingling with disbelief. 18 children, 18 pregnancies, 18 removals, and now death. And all for profit. Robert, informed of the outcome, initially assessed the newborn with the same cold calculation he had applied to all previous children. But this infant, small and unmistakably bearing his features, unsettled him. This was not an anonymous commodity he could place safely. The child's resemblance to him posed a danger. If shown to Richmond associates or any family connected to the Hartleys, recognition could unravel his careful arrangements. He ordered Rachel to care for the baby while he considered the implications. The tiny girl survived only 3 days, nursed by the plantation's lone nursing mother. Her death, unsurprising given her prematurity, allowed Robert to avoid exposure, but it did nothing to lessen the horror of what had occurred. The aftermath of Sarah's death marked the beginning of systemic collapse. Fires began in November 1856, destroying a tobacco barn and hundreds of pounds of cured product. Subsequent fires struck the stables and even part of the main house. Tools broke, supplies spoiled, livestock escaped or died mysteriously. The overseer's brutal methods failed to restore control, and the workforce, having witnessed the cost of compliance firsthand, quietly resisted. This resistance wasn't formally organized, but it was deliberate. The destruction, combined with diminishing returns from the illegal child placement operation, led to financial instability. Robert, now 61, alone and increasingly paranoid, turned inward. He reviewed his ledgers obsessively, his drinking worsening. The secret ledger, documenting 18 years of exploitation, became a nightly obsession. Each entry was a stark reminder. 18 children, 1 woman, decades of profit built on suffering. His mental state deteriorated, and by October 1857 he was dead at his desk. Heart failure, the doctor concluded, though the stress, alcohol, and moral reckoning likely contributed. The plantation, left to a distant cousin, fell into chaos. Enslaved workers escaped or resisted, fields lay fallow, and by the Civil War, the once thriving estate was barely recognizable. After emancipation, many former slaves scattered, some remaining as sharecroppers, others moving north in search of freedom. Rachel relocated to Philadelphia, her midwifery skills still invaluable in a chaotic post-war environment. In 1889, at nearly 85, she finally sent her diary to an abolitionist newspaper. Her testimony ensured that the horrors she had witnessed, Sarah's suffering, the systematic exploitation, and the 17 previous children removed, were no longer invisible. For the first time, the story of the woman reduced to an initial in Robert's ledger, who endured 18 pregnancies for profit, entered public consciousness. Scholars, genealogists, and historians began piecing together the fragments, confirming the patterns Rachel had meticulously recorded. 18 children, 1 woman, systematic exploitation over almost 20 years. The Hartley Plantation became a case study in systemic exploitation, a microcosm of slavery's capacity to reduce human beings to commodities and strip them of identity. One of the lingering mysteries concerned the fires and sabotage of 1856-57. Historians debated whether these acts were coordinated acts of revenge or merely coincidental accidents amplified by the plantation's instability. The timing suggested deliberate intent. The destruction was systematic, but proof remained elusive. Whether spontaneous or planned, the result was the same. The plantation's operations collapsed in the wake of Sarah's death. Her passing marked a turning point. Compliance no longer offered safety, and the weight of exploitation, combined with human resistance, brought the Hartley estate to its knees. Rachel herself lived into her 80s, working in Philadelphia at a hospital serving freed people. She bore witness to countless hardships, but never forgot the woman she had tried to protect and the children she had seen taken away. Her diary, preserved in a separate archive, contains her final reflections, pages marked with shaking handwriting and smudges that may be tears. She wrote knowing that, though the law could never restore Sarah's life, acknowledgement and testimony could ensure that at least history would remember. Even today, the ledger and the diary survive in climate-controlled archives, fragile but legible. Researchers continue to study them, uncovering stories of exploitation and resilience, reconstructing lives that the system sought to erase. Each time the final page of Robert's ledger is reached, where he wrote shakily, "Burned it all. God forgive me," readers confront the tension between meticulous record-keeping and the absence of justice. Scholars and students traced 12 of the 18 children through birth records, foundling homes, adoption papers, marriage certificates, and census data. Family trees were painstakingly reconstructed, revealing descendants who had lived ordinary lives, mostly unaware of the extraordinary and tragic circumstances of their origins. Some families were shocked when approached by researchers, learning for the first time that grandparents or great-grandparents had been born into a context of systematic exploitation. Some accepted this truth, reconciling it with gaps or mysteries in family history. Others rejected the findings entirely, insisting the records were mistaken or malicious. 6 of the 18 children, however, remained untraceable. They vanished into history, leaving no documentation, no living memory, no trace of their existence beyond the ledger. These disappearances reinforced the profound anonymity that had defined their mother's life. Sarah herself remained unidentifiable. Census records listed women of appropriate age and status, but none could be definitively connected to her. A promising lead emerged in Detroit. A man whose grandmother had escaped Virginia during the Civil War spoke of a woman named Sarah who carried grief quietly and rage even quieter. Yet third-hand accounts, filtered through decades of retelling, could never constitute proof. She remained, in life and history, anonymous. Despite the gaps, historians, economists, and medical scholars studied the case extensively. Economists analyzed the illegal adoption and placement system. Medical historians examined the health consequences of repeated pregnancies under primitive care. Psychologists assessed the trauma imposed on both mother and children, and legal scholars debated whether any retroactive justice could ever be attempted. Yet in archives and university vaults, the ledger and Rachel's diary preserved the painful, irrefutable testimony. Names erased, lives commodified, history recorded meticulously by those who had perpetuated and witnessed the exploitation. Sarah, whose body had been a tool for profit, whose life had ended in anonymity, remained present only in these records. Her endurance, her suffering, and her quiet rebellion were immortalized not in monuments or family lore, but in fragile pages preserved against the erasure imposed by slavery's machinery. Her story, partial, fragmentary, and incomplete, serves as a stark reminder of the human cost of systematic oppression and the power of memory, testimony, and documentation in preserving the truth. The Hartley Plantation, once a thriving tobacco estate, had long since ceased to function as a coherent operation. After Robert Hartley's death in October 1857, the plantation passed to a distant cousin, who arrived to find chaos. Buildings damaged by fire, fences down, livestock lost, and the workforce fractured. Approximately 60 of the original 200 enslaved people had escaped, seizing the opportunity created by disorder. The remaining workers were openly hostile, refusing direct orders, working minimally, and waiting for either the plantation to collapse entirely or their own chance to flee. Despite his attempts, the cousin failed to restore operations over the next 2 years. Labor shortages, combined with the extensive structural damage and lingering resentment, rendered any revival impossible. By 1859, the property was sold to a consortium that divided the land into smaller parcels. Some plots went to neighboring planters, others were purchased by Richmond investors. The formerly enslaved people were sold separately or managed to escape before transactions could be finalized. The once grand plantation, which had consumed Sarah's life and the lives of her children, ceased to exist as a single entity. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, the physical remnants of the Hartley estate had deteriorated further. The main house stood largely empty, vandalized by passing soldiers from both the Union and Confederate armies. Fields had reverted to wild growth, cabins collapsed or rotted, and the once organized plantation's infrastructure lay in ruin. The land, once the site of methodical exploitation and suffering, became almost unrecognizable. In the post-war Reconstruction period, formerly enslaved people scattered. Some remained in Virginia, taking up sharecropping or work in emerging cities. Others moved north to Philadelphia, New York, or Boston, seeking opportunities for independence and safety. Rachel's diary, once secret and private, now entered a world that had officially outlawed slavery, but remained unprepared to confront the personal horrors it had produced. The abolitionist newspaper published excerpts over 3 issues in the fall of 1889, bringing a mixture of shock, disbelief, and denial among readers. Some were horrified, recognizing the systematic cruelty described. Others dismissed the accounts as exaggeration or propaganda, claiming that the practices were long abolished and therefore irrelevant. Still, a small number of readers grasped the gravity of the revelations and understood that the diary preserved a truth that could never be recovered through any other source. The minister who had once visited the Hartley plantation offered his own memoirs in the 1890s. His recollections, far less detailed than Rachel's, nonetheless corroborated key aspects of her account. Though he had witnessed only fragments of the daily horrors, his testimony confirmed that the woman, Sarah, as Rachel suggested, had been subjected to repeated exploitation and that the children were removed systematically. Together, the diary and the minister's records provided a multi-layered corroboration of the events, though they could not restore the woman's voice or identity. By the early 1900s, academic historians took up the investigation. They cross-referenced Rachel's diary with surviving plantation records, church registers, county archives, and foundling home logs. Slowly, the pattern emerged. 18 children, born over nearly 2 decades to a single woman whose name was rarely recorded, systematically removed and placed elsewhere. The ledger meticulously kept by Robert Hartley proved crucial, its coded entries aligning with Rachel's descriptions. The dates matched, the numbers aligned. The system of exploitation she had described was validated by the very calculations of the man who profited from it. Genealogical research began in earnest in the 1940s. Undocumented and anonymous, their fates, like Sarah's own name, could not be confirmed. Despite exhaustive research, the identities of many individuals involved in her life and labor were lost forever. Yet the ledger and diary ensured that the system's mechanics, the cold, systematic exploitation, the removal of human lives for financial gain, were preserved as undeniable fact. Sarah's story, though incomplete, became a symbol of the machinery of slavery. A single life consumed entirely for profit, yet remembered because 2 witnesses refused to let it vanish. Rachel's diary also highlighted the psychological and social consequences of this systematic oppression. Historians studying the records in the 20th century emphasized that slavery's impact extended far beyond the legal or financial. Trauma, erasure of identity, and the destruction of familial bonds were all part of the mechanism that enabled people like Robert Hartley to operate undisturbed for decades. Even when the legal structures crumbled, the physical and social aftershocks persisted. The children's descendants, scattered across Virginia and beyond, lived ordinary lives, but often carried unspoken gaps, mysteries, and unrecorded histories. Some families would not discover the truth until contacted by genealogical researchers decades later, forced to reconcile the ordinary with the extraordinary, the mundane with the unthinkable. Meanwhile, the Hartley Plantation site itself faded from memory. Over the decades, the land was subdivided, developed, and built over. By the 20th century, a shopping center occupied the ground where tobacco fields had once stretched, and asphalt concealed the graves of Sarah and her 18th child. A historical marker noted only that the property had been a tobacco plantation in the 18th and 19th centuries, with no mention of the human suffering buried beneath. The ledger, the diary, and the corroborating archival evidence collectively testify to a human life almost completely erased. A woman named Sarah, mother of 18 children, forced into anonymity, yet remembered because two meticulous witnesses refused to let her story disappear entirely. Their memories carried stories of slavery and survival, but many details of the Hartley Plantation, especially the systematic exploitation of one woman, were lost to time. Rachel herself made her way north to Philadelphia. By then in her 70s, she leveraged decades of experience in midwifery and care to assist thousands of freed people who were arriving in the city, many sick, injured, or traumatized by war and displacement. The chaos of post-Civil War urban life demanded every ounce of her skill, yet she never stopped remembering the woman whose suffering she had witnessed firsthand. In 1889, with her own death approaching at nearly 85 years old, Rachel decided to make her diary public. For 40 years, it had been secret, the only personal testimony of Sarah's suffering and the systematic exploitation she endured. Now, with slavery abolished and her life ending, Rachel sought a measure of historical justice, hoping that acknowledgement, even if delayed, might preserve Sarah's memory. When the diary appeared in print, reactions were mixed. Some readers recognized the horror, calling for public investigation and legal scrutiny. Others dismissed the accounts as exaggerated, irrelevant to contemporary society, or even maliciously anti-Southern propaganda. Yet the evidence could not be ignored entirely. The Hartley Ledger, preserved meticulously by Robert Hartley, corroborated many of Rachel's entries. The coded entries in the ledger corresponded precisely with births, transfers, and placements of the children. Historians, genealogists, and economists later confirmed that 18 children had been born to a single woman, systematically removed, and placed elsewhere, with a final tally of 12 children being identifiable through adoption, marriage, census, and death records. The 6 remaining children disappeared into history, undocumented and anonymous. Even as the Hartley Plantation disappeared under modern development, the traces of its human cost persisted quietly in records, diaries, and the scattered lives of those it had exploited. The ledger, fragile and faded, survived in a university archive. Researchers approached it with white gloves, turning its brittle pages carefully, noting every entry. 18 children, each assigned a number, each representing both a sum of money and a fragment of Robert Hartley's genetic legacy. The meticulous handwriting chronicled the transactions of a life reduced to calculation, the systematic commodification of a single woman who had endured 18 pregnancies and died at 44, buried anonymously with her last child. Rachel's diary complemented the ledger with vivid human detail. It recorded the woman's suffering, her endurance, and the events surrounding each birth. Rachel's handwriting trembled in the later pages, sometimes smudged by tears, sometimes blotched from shaking hands, as she detailed the final child's premature birth and death. The diary was more than a record of births. It was testimony, an attempt to preserve Sarah's humanity against the deliberate erasure imposed by the plantation system. Without Rachel, the ledger alone would have documented only numbers and dates. With her, it became a witness to cruelty, resilience, and silent rebellion. Academic historians, genealogists, economists, medical scholars, and legal experts eventually reconstructed the sequence of events. They verified 12 of the 18 children through adoption records, marriage certificates, and census data. These children had lived ordinary lives, raised families, and died without knowing their origins. Descendants contacted in the mid-20th century were often shocked. They had never imagined that their grandparents or great-grandparents had been born into such circumstances. The enduring lesson of Sarah's life and death is both tragic and instructive. She lived entirely for others' profit, her body consumed by a system that treated human beings as commodities. Yet through documentation, preservation, and careful research, her existence has been acknowledged. Her suffering could not be undone, nor could the deaths of her children be reversed, but the historical record ensures that she cannot be forgotten. Her story challenges modern readers to confront the full implications of slavery, not abstractly, not legally, but personally, in terms of the lived reality of those who endured it. Even today, her absence is palpable. Her name, probably Sarah, survives only as an initial in Robert Hartley's ledger. Her children lived without knowing her, carrying her legacy unknowingly through generations. Researchers who study the ledger or Rachel's diary confront a stark truth. History often records what oppressors meticulously documented, and justice is frequently delayed or denied entirely to the victims. Yet the existence of this documentation, however partial, allows modern descendants and scholars to recover what would otherwise have been lost. The final pages of Rachel's diary and the last entry in Robert's ledger burned it all. God forgive me, stand as grim witnesses to the scale of human exploitation, the quiet endurance of one woman, and the slow, incomplete arc of justice through documentation. Sarah's life, her children, and the collapse of the plantation serve as reminders of the cost of treating people as objects and the resilience of memory in preserving truth. Even beneath a modern parking lot, where asphalt conceals the soil, Sarah's story survives. Her endurance, her humanity, and her suffering are recorded in ink and testimony, ensuring that, even centuries later, she matters. The 6 untraced children and their descendants remained unknown, a reminder that history preserves only what is documented, and many lives slip entirely through its sieve. The legacy of Sarah's suffering was not only in her offspring, but in the systemic collapse that followed her death. Historians noted the fires, sabotages, and disruptions that plagued the plantation after her final labor. Whether these were deliberate acts of revenge, spontaneous resistance, or coincidental misfortunes, the results were clear. The operation could not sustain itself. The enslaved community, previously bound by fear and enforced compliance, had silently recalibrated their understanding of survival and agency. The collapse of the Hartley plantation became an emblem of how human endurance, even uncoordinated and unseen, could challenge the structures of oppression. In modern times, the physical site of the plantation is a shopping center in Pennsylvania County, Virginia. A historical marker notes the property's use for tobacco production and its seizure during the Civil War, but it omits the darker history entirely. Beneath the asphalt lie unmarked graves. Sarah and her 18th child, both erased from formal memory, their lives acknowledged only in ledger entries and diary pages. Scholars, genealogists, and students continue to study the ledger and Rachel's diary, piecing together fragments of truth and bearing witness to what was once intended to vanish completely. The story has become a tool for education, demonstrating the mechanics of exploitation, the erasure of individual identity, and the importance of testimony in preserving human history. The Hartley case forces reflection. For every documented story like Sarah's, how many others were erased entirely? How many endured similar fates without record, without acknowledgement? And yet, in the surviving ledger and diary, there is a testament to resilience and witness. Sarah lived. She endured. She bore 18 children. She died at 44, anonymous in life and death, yet her existence persists in history through the courage of those who refuse to let her vanish entirely. That persistence is her final, lasting legacy,